Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Easter for Sceptics. In this episode we're looking at the central events of the burial of Jesus and the claim that his tomb was empty. On Good Friday, Jesus and the other two men crucified with him all died. The other men were taken, their bodies were taken and cast into a pauper's grave on a rubbish dump. But Jesus was different. What actually happened to Jesus' body after he died? Well, this is where we meet Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph is recorded in all four Gospels as going to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and asking for the body of Jesus, that it be taken down from the cross so that he might give it a decent burial. Now, Joseph was a member of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, but he had not been part of the rushed trial during that night. And he certainly never consented to the crucifixion of Jesus. He had heard Jesus preach, and he was convinced by his preaching. Maybe he'd even witnessed one of the miracles that Jesus had performed. And so he didn't want to have anything to do with the plot that wanted to get Jesus crucified. He was also a wealthy man, and probably an older man, because he had already made preparations for his own death by having a tomb carved into a rock just outside the city walls of Jerusalem, a cave in which his body would lay when he died. It was an unused tomb, so it was sitting there ready, and he was therefore able to use it to bury the body of Jesus. And along with Joseph of Arimathea comes another character, a character who's already been mentioned in John's Gospel, called Nicodemus. Nicodemus is another secret disciple. And so they take down the body of Jesus from the cross with great respect. They wrap it in cloths and they carry it to the garden nearby where the tomb was located, and they lay it down in Joseph's tomb. Now, the Bible also tells us that Nicodemus brought about 75 pounds of spices. That's about half a body weight. And he packed those around the body as it lay in the tomb, and then together they rolled the stone over the doorway into the tomb so that the tomb was sealed. Now, Joseph and Nicodemus did this. They may have had other people to help them. They also had two women who witnessed this, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, as she's described, Mary, the wife of Cleopas. We'll come to her husband Cleopas in the final video. These two women had been with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary's sister Salome at the cross. Presumably Mary, the mother of Jesus, has gone home in her grief, and Salome has gone with her. But Mary Magdalene and Mary, the wife of Cleopas, go with Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They follow them to the tomb, and they witness where the body is buried. They needed to do that because they wanted to come back after the Sabbath and to anoint the body themselves, to pay their own homage and respect to the dead body of Jesus. So they watch the tomb as Joseph and Nicodemus are burying the body of Jesus, and then all of them, after it is sealed, go home. Now, the next day, which is the Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, the Jewish leaders have a panic. And they go back to bother Pontius Pilate again, and they say to him, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" Now, clearly the words of Jesus have haunted them, and they are very concerned. They fear not that those words might come true, but that the disciples might act on those words and come and steal away the body and claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so Matthew records that Pilate gave them permission to take some guards and to put a seal on the tomb and to guard it. And these words in Matthew's Gospel are filled with irony. "Go make the tomb as secure as you know how." Well, my response to that is, good luck with that, because it's one of the most futile gestures in human history. You see, the issue with the tomb of Jesus was not with people meddling with it from the outside, but the power of the man whose body was laid inside. That was the real issue of the tomb. So there is the tomb on Holy Saturday, as we now call it, sealed up with a large stone, with seals of wax fixed to the wall of the tomb and fixed to the stone to make sure that nobody has moved the stone, holding it all shut, and there is a row of guards guarding the tomb. It is impregnable. Surely nothing could ever intervene to change this situation. How was it then that around dawn on Easter Sunday, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the wife of Cleopas, come back to the tomb carrying their spices, wanting to anoint the body of Jesus, and wondering who will be there to roll away the stone for them? And when they get to the tomb, they find the stone has already been rolled away and the tomb is empty. The place where they saw the body of Jesus laid, the body is no longer there. And they run back, and very quickly Peter and John come running to the tomb, and they verify that what they have discovered is true. Now, how do we explain that? Well, there are 5 possible explanations as to how this might have happened, and we need to deal with each of them in turn. Explanation 1 is that the women went to the wrong tomb. It was early morning, the kind of half light of day, and it's easy to mistake things in the shadows of early morning. So this argument says they came to the wrong tomb. They found another tomb that also happened to be empty, which is a bit unusual, and they went to that tomb and jumped to the conclusion that Jesus must have risen from the dead. These are the same women who have travelled with Jesus, who have cared for him in his ministry. They know what he looked like. They went to the cross and witnessed his crucifixion through all those long hours. They followed the body of Jesus as it was carried down from Golgotha to the tomb. They knew where it was buried. They saw the ledge on which the body was buried and the layout of the tomb. They saw the stone rolled across the tomb. They knew where they had to go back to. And if they got it wrong, and these 2 women were sort of mistaken witnesses, and the whole church was built on this mistaken testimony, then all you had to do was find the right tomb and open it up and bring out the body of Jesus, and nobody ever did that. The second explanation is that Joseph of Arimathea moved the body. He buried the body of Jesus that night in his own tomb, but he quickly arranged for another tomb to be available after the Sabbath, and very early in the morning of Easter Day he took the body and moved it to that other tomb. But Joseph was publicly identifying himself with Jesus by burying his body, and he was honoured to have the body of Jesus buried in his own tomb. Very likely his tomb would have had several niches in which different bodies could be buried, and I'm sure he anticipated that one day when he himself died, he would be buried in that tomb and be honoured to have the body of Jesus buried alongside him. That was all in his mind as he buried Jesus in his tomb. Now, if that wasn't the case, if he had moved Jesus to another tomb, and 7 weeks later the disciples had gone into Jerusalem and proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead, Joseph, as a man of high standing in the Jewish community, would have turned round to them and said, "I'm sorry, I moved the body, and this is where I buried it." The third explanation is that the Jews stole the body. But Matthew, in his gospel, tells us that they were deeply worried that the disciples would steal the body, so much so that they placed a guard on the tomb and they sealed the stone. And they did everything they could to ensure that nobody could steal the body of Jesus. What interest did they have in stealing the body of Jesus? The only thing that can be said here is that after the resurrection, when the guards who were posted there have been struck dumb by the earthquake that opened the tomb, and they realized that Jesus had risen from the dead, they went back into the city, they told the Jewish authorities, and Matthew tells us they paid them money to keep them quiet and to say that the disciples had come and stolen the body. So I think we have to write off option 3. The fourth explanation is that the Romans stole the body. If they did, and they'd taken the body of Jesus and buried it somewhere else in secret, why didn't they produce it when the Christians started to stand up and say Jesus has risen from the dead? Think about it. The Roman authorities went out of their way to persecute the Christian church. They put thousands of Christians to death. If they knew all along that Jesus was still dead and buried in Jerusalem, why didn't they bring out the body of Jesus to prove it? To have had that opportunity and that advantage, it is inexplicable if they never used it. The fifth explanation is that Jesus did not die at all, and he swooned, he was laid in the tomb, and he recovered. Now, very, very occasionally, people have recovered from a crucifixion if they weren't left on the cross too long, and there was some doubt about whether they were dead when they were removed from it. But while that is not entirely unknown, it's extremely rare. But we have a very clear record of the crucifixion of Jesus. John tells us in his gospel that when the soldiers came to the bodies again to look at them towards the end of the day, knowing that they needed them dead before the Sabbath and they needed to get them down from the 3 crosses, they broke the legs of the other 2 criminals who were still alive. And as a result of that, they died. But when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. And these are professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. And John tells us one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now what that tells us is that in hanging there on the cross dead, Jesus' blood, which had built up inside him from internal injuries, had already begun to congeal. The thick red part of his blood had congealed, and the plasma, the fluid, had pulled away from it. And when they plunged the spear into his side, there was a gush of blood and water, clear evidence that he was dead. Now, even if he had survived that, for Jesus then to be carried to the tomb, laid in a cold tomb in April, and covered with half a body weight of spices, and have a stone rolled across the tomb, for Jesus to have swooned and somehow recovered in the tomb and stood up and made his way to the door and rolled the stone away in his own weak strength after all his injuries, is very, very unlikely. It defies logic that any of that could have happened. And if it had happened, what would happen to such a person in all their mortal weakness? That is not the person who appeared to the disciples, as we shall see next time. Nobody has any record of a weak, wounded, close to death Jesus stumbling out of the tomb and needing to have his wounds bandaged. No, that is not anywhere in the story. So we have to write off that possibility as well. So none of these 5 theories stand up. But there's one other piece of evidence that really fascinates me. When the disciples and the women came to the tomb, what did they find? Peter and John came to the tomb, and there was a clue left for them in the tomb. Peter and John found this. John says, he, Peter, saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped round Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Now, if a grave robber had come into the tomb, rolled the stone away, and stolen the body of Jesus, they either would have taken it in the grave clothes, or, for whatever reason, they would have unwrapped the grave clothes and thrown them all over the tomb. But what Peter and John find is the strips of cloth lying there as though the body had been in them, but the body has somehow miraculously come through them and gone from the tomb. So if you like, the shroud is lying there as a chrysalis, an empty chrysalis, and the headcloth that was wrapped around his head is separate, maybe even folded, as though Jesus stood up, took it off and folded it up and needed it no longer. There is a huge clue here that nobody has taken the body, but the body has miraculously been raised from the dead and exists in a whole new dimension, which is what we discover when we come to meet Jesus in his resurrection appearances. And we'll look at those in our final episode on Easter Sunday. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time.